December 3, 1944. The Pacific Ocean heaved, a vast expanse of cold liquid steel under a sky the color of slate. Far out, the horizon was a smudge, a place where the gray of the water simply dissolved into the gray of the clouds. A transport ship, its hull streaked with rust and the salt stains of a long war, sliced through the restless waves. Its journey was a relentless push forward, away from battlefields and toward an unknown fate. On the open deck, a small group of Japanese women stood huddled in a profound silence. Some wore the threadbare, ill-fitting uniforms of military auxiliaries, fabric faded from sun and fear. Others were wrapped in kimonos, the soft patterns of cherry blossoms and cranes now muted and worn, garments they had snatched from their homes in ruined villages as their world fell apart. Their gaze was not fixed on the endless sea, but downward, toward the heavy boots of the American guards who watched them. The soldiers held their rifles with a practiced ease, their posture casual, as if this crossing was nothing more than routine. But for the women, every breath was an exercise in dread. They were the living embodiment of a failure they had been taught was worse than death itself. The enemy, their commanders had warned, would not only steal their freedom, but would strip them of their very dignity. Mercy, they had been assured, was a word that did not exist in the American vocabulary. And yet, here they were, alive, breathing the sharp, salt-laced air, their minds racing with visions of the cruelty that surely awaited them on the shores of Hawaii. Among them stood a nurse from Manila. Her hands, which had once stitched wounds with unwavering steadiness by the flickering light of the lantern, while bombs shook the hospital walls, were now clenched into tight fists at her sides. The final words of her commander echoed in her mind, a relentless drumbeat. "Do not let yourself be taken." Beside her, a young clerk who had been captured on Guam secretly clutched a rosary deep within her sleeve. Her fingers traced the worn, smooth beads, a silent, desperate prayer she dared not show. A younger woman, barely 20 years old, leaned toward an elder, her whisper a dry rustle of sound. "They will parade us through the—" Women could not understand, their laughter sharp and foreign against the sigh of the waves. The guards were neither cruel nor kind. Theirs was a profound indifference, an absence of feeling that was, in its own way, more unsettling than outright brutality. The women had steeled themselves for shouts, for the blunt impact of a rifle butt, for every imaginable humiliation. Instead, they were met with this strange, unnerving quiet, a vacuum that left far too much room for their own imaginations to conjure horrors. The air itself carried unfamiliar scents that drifted from the ship's mess hall. The strong, dark aroma of brewing coffee, a luxury they had not known for years. The savory smell of canned beef warming in vast metal tins. The sweet, pungent scent of American tobacco. Compared to the meager rations they had subsisted on, a handful of rice stretched thin with barley husks, a scrap of dried fish on a lucky day, this abundance felt like a deliberate insult. One woman muttered, her voice laced with bitterness and a sliver of disbelief. "They feed their soldiers like kings." It is worth remembering what December of 1944 truly meant. The war in the Pacific was reaching its bloody crescendo. American forces, island by agonizing island, were pushing back an empire that had once seemed invincible. Casualties mounted on both sides, a relentless tide of death. For the Japanese, surrender remained a concept shrouded in absolute dishonor. Yet here, on this single, rusting transport ship, the unthinkable had already happened. Dozens of women, pulled from scattered field hospitals and remote island outposts, had been taken prisoner. For them, capture was not just a personal failure. It was a deep cultural stain, a disgrace to their families and their nation. The words of the imperial rescript were etched into their souls: death before dishonor. To return alive was to betray one's ancestors and the emperor himself. That weight pressed hardest on the nurse from Manila. She moved to the railing, her hands gripping the cold, damp metal. She stared down into the endless, churning sea, measuring the distance between the deck and the dark, indifferent waves below. A single leap, that was all it would take to reclaim her honor, to obey her commander's last order. But as she leaned forward, each creak of the ropes was a sound that underscored their utter powerlessness. In the suffocating darkness, some prayed, their whispers so faint they were almost lost in the vast, empty silence of the ocean. Others lay awake, their eyes wide open, staring into nothing. Their minds had become relentless projectors, replaying every horrific story they had ever been told. Rumors they had once dismissed as propaganda now felt terrifyingly real. They thought of Nanking, where it was said women were violated until their spirits broke. They whispered stories of civilians shot on sandy beaches, their bodies left for the tides. They envisioned captives starved until their bones were sharp ridges beneath their skin. These tales circulated like a poison, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to ignore. They had braced their souls for degradation, certain it would begin the moment the ship's engines fell silent. And yet, the Americans' behavior was a constant, unnerving puzzle. When one of the younger women fell ill with the fever, a medic appeared not with a sneer, but with aspirin and a clean, dry blanket. When another woman stumbled on the slick deck, a guard's hand shot out to steady her arm, preventing a fall. These were not acts of kindness in their minds. They were tricks, preludes to a far harsher, more calculated cruelty. Every small mercy only sharpened their suspicion. The ocean stretched on, an endless expanse of time and water that forced reflection. One young auxiliary, her uniform hanging loose on her thin frame, thought of her brother. He had been drafted at 19, a boy full of nervous pride, and sent to Saipan. She had received one letter, full of bravado and longing for home, before he vanished into the war's great silence. Another woman, older, remembered the roar of crowds in Tokyo years before, when the great Babe Ruth and other American baseball legends had toured Japan. For a brief, hopeful time, baseball had been hailed as a bridge between their nations. Now, those joyful cheers seemed like a foolish, distant dream. Each sunrise brought a fresh wave of dread. Hawaii was no longer a word that conjured images of paradise. It was the doorstep to the enemy's heartland, islands they had left behind. But the harbor told a different story. Great battleships were moored in solemn rows, the scars of December 7th still visible on the waters of Pearl Harbor, where the rusted, skeletal hulls of sunken vessels lay half submerged, permanent monuments to an act that had awakened a terrible vengeance. The transport ship's engines slowed to a low thrum. The guards ordered the women to line up, their voices firm but not harsh. There were no chains. Ropes were used to guide them, a simple boundary between them and the dock. As they shuffled forward, each woman held her breath. They had prepared for this moment since their capture, steeling themselves for spittle, for fists, for mocking laughter. The gangway thudded against the pier, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. One by one they descended, their worn sandals scraping against the wood. On the dock below, rows of American soldiers stood waiting, their uniforms crisply pressed, their rifles polished and gleaming. Behind them, a small crowd of civilians watched with curious eyes. Hawaiian women carrying baskets of fruit, children peering from behind their mothers' skirts. No one spat, no one jeered. A silence, heavier and more suffocating than any insult, stretched across the harbor. The nurse from Manila clutched her thin blanket and dared to look up. She met the eyes of the soldiers and saw not hatred, but an unnerving, almost awkward curiosity. One young GI, perhaps no older than her own lost brother, leaned on his rifle with a faint, uncertain smile, as if he had no idea how one was supposed to greet an enemy who looked so tired, so defeated, so utterly human. The women exchanged confused glances. This was not the reception their hearts had been prepared for. Something was wrong, or perhaps something was profoundly, terrifyingly right. As they were marched toward a line of waiting trucks, one of the younger women whispered, her voice sharp with a new kind of fear, "If this is mercy, what comes next?" The trucks rattled away from the harbor, their wooden sides creaking as they carried the women inland, away from the familiar sound of the sea. Dust from the unpaved roads swirled in the warm Hawaiian air. The menace. A sergeant began barking instructions, his words translated haltingly by an interpreter. "You will be registered. You will be housed. You will receive rations. Follow the rules. You will not be harmed." The bluntness of the promise was more startling than any threat could have been. Registration began. One by one, their names were recorded, or at least the fragments of names they dared to give. Some gave false surnames, terrified their families back home would be shamed. Others refused to speak at all, their silence their last remaining shield. The clerks, unbothered, simply marked them with numbers, an act that stripped them of identity, yet felt strangely, impersonally merciful. The barracks were rough, but they were clean. Each woman was given a cot and a coarse wool blanket, warmer than anything they had known for months. And then came the soap. Small, simple bars stamped with English lettering. For the first time in weeks, maybe longer, they could wash away the filth of captivity. The sharp scent of lye and lavender filled the air, almost dizzying. One woman scrubbed her arms until her skin was flushed pink, as if she could wash away the war itself. Food was next. They lined up outside a mess hall, clutching metal trays. Inside, cooks ladled out stewed beef, soft bread rolls, and strong black coffee. The women stared at their trays in disbelief. Meat was a distant memory in Japan by 1944, and coffee was a myth. Some hesitated, their old fears of poison and trickery rising to the surface. But hunger was a more powerful force. One bite, then another. Soon, the hall was filled with the quiet, surreal sound of captives eating like guests. Later, one woman would admit in a whisper, "I hated myself for enjoying their food more than I had enjoyed our own." The days settled into a strange rhythm. Roll call at dawn. Simple work details in the kitchens or mending uniforms. Guards walked the perimeters, but rarely intruded. Word of the Bataan Death March and other atrocities had reached Hawaii, whispered even among the American soldiers. The contrast was a silent, screaming truth. Here, the captives lived. There, so many had died. Yet life inside the wire was its own form of torment. Every memory of freedom was a fresh wound. To be alive but powerless was a prison in good-natured mockery. Then came the sound, a sharp, explosive crack of a bat meeting a ball. It echoed across the camp, a sound as piercing as a rifle shot. The ball soared high, a white speck against the bright, unforgiving sky. For a moment, it seemed to hang there, weightless, before plummeting back to earth and smacking into a leather glove with a sound that was both satisfying and deeply unsettling. The women, who had been shuffling back from the mess line with their metal trays, froze. It was baseball. Not in a grand stadium, not with crisp, clean uniforms, but the rhythm of it, the very soul of it, was unmistakable. And that was the problem. It had been their game, too. In the 1930s, before the world had caught fire, Tokyo's Meiji Jingu Stadium had rocked with the cheers of thousands of fans. Schoolboys across Japan had dreamed of playing in the Koshien tournament, the pinnacle of high school glory. And now here, on this patch of dirt in Hawaii, the enemy was claiming that same joy, that same ritual, as if it were theirs alone. One of the older auxiliaries, her face etched with lines of grief and fatigue, whispered, "They have taken even this from us." But a younger woman standing beside her whispered back, her voice filled with a reluctant awe, "No, they are keeping it alive." The players moved with a fluid, unconscious grace. A runner slid into second base, a cloud of red dust exploding around him, as the baseman tagged him out with a practiced, almost gentle touch. The women couldn't help themselves. Murmured commentary began to spill from lips that had been pressed into silent obedience for weeks. Safe. Out. A good arm. Words they thought they had left behind in another life, in stadiums that were now likely nothing more than rubble. One of the soldiers, a tall man with a wide grin, noticed their rapt attention. He lifted the ball, tossed it in his palm once, then unleashed a throw across the field with a casual, brutal speed. The women gasped collectively. The ball cut through the air like a projectile. It was too fast, too clean. Some of them had seen Japan's own high school champions play before the war, but they had never witnessed power like this. With every pitch, with every swing, the propaganda image of the clumsy field grounders in a dusty lot. His movements just as quick, his shouts of triumph just as loud. He had been sent to Manchuria and had never returned. Now, staring at these laughing, living men, she saw his ghost. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. To weep here would be the ultimate betrayal. History itself seemed to mock them with its ironies. Baseball had been brought to Japan in 1872 by an American teacher, Horace Wilson. By the 1920s, it had become the nation's most beloved sport, a symbol of its modern identity. In 1934, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig had toured Tokyo, drawing hundreds of thousands of roaring fans. For a brief, shining moment, baseball had been proof that two nations on opposite sides of the world could share not just commerce, but culture. Then came Pearl Harbor, and that bridge was consumed by flames. And now, under the hot Hawaiian sun, the game was being resurrected inside a prison camp. A strange, silent dialogue between captives and their captors. One of the clerks turned to the others, her voice bitter. "They play like gods," she whispered. "Did we ever truly own this game?" Her question hung in the hot, still air, heavy with shame. Another woman answered quietly, "Perhaps we never owned it. Perhaps it owns us." That afternoon, a subtle shift occurred. When the soldiers paused their game for a drink of water, a few of the women lingered near the fence, their curiosity overcoming their fear. The Americans noticed. With an exaggerated bravado, they began to show off. The pitcher threw curveballs that seemed to defy physics, bending like serpents through the air. A catcher caught one with his bare hands, wincing theatrically at the sting. The women couldn't help it. A few of them laughed, quickly covering their mouths as if horrified by the sound they had made. The guards nearby raised their eyebrows in surprise, but said nothing. For the first time since their capture, a sound other than weeping or whispering had broken through the wire. The tension between their national pride and the evidence of their own eyes only deepened. To admit admiration was to betray everything they had been taught. But to deny it, transport ship was torpedoed. His victory was a ghost. The living, breathing skill belonged to the enemy. The conflict was not just cultural. It was deeply personal. Baseball was a memory of brothers and fathers, of long, lazy summers before the world had gone mad. To see it played so well by the very men who might have killed their families was an unbearable torment. And yet, it was also irresistible. The bat cracked, the ball soared, and for a fleeting moment, the women were not prisoners. They were spectators again. They were girls in the stands, their hearts leaping with the graceful arc of the ball. The memory of that first game lingered in the air long after the dust had settled. It was not just a sphere of leather and stitches. It was a spark. It was a shared language spoken without words, a reminder that some things could cross the boundaries that politics and propaganda had drawn in blood. From that day forward, every game carried a new, complex weight. The women no longer watched with simple suspicion or envy. They watched with a dangerous, burgeoning tenderness, as if seeing shattered fragments of their own lives reflected back at them. The nurse, the one who had once measured the distance to the dark waves below, now found her eyes drawn to the makeshift diamond whenever the soldiers played. The easy laughter that rose from the field no longer felt like a personal wound to her pride. Instead, it conjured ghosts. It reminded her of long, humid summer evenings in Osaka, the air thick with the sound of cicadas. She saw her brother, his cap askew, practicing his pitch again and again until the light failed completely. He had vanished into the vast, devouring maw of the war. Yet here, in the sun-bleached dust of Hawaii, his shadow seemed to flicker back to life. This recognition did not erase her grief, but it softened its sharpest edges. For others, the shift came more grudgingly. The clerk, who secretly clutched her rosary, still muttered that any admiration was a form of betrayal. But even she could not stop her eyes from glancing through the fence. When one of the soldiers hit a towering fly ball that seemed to scrape the very clouds, In those weeks, the women began to murmur amongst themselves, trying to make sense of the contradictions that pressed in on them from all sides. They had been taught that the enemy was brutal and barbaric, yet here were medics who brought them milk for their health. They had been told Americans were uncultured and crude, yet here they were, playing a game of skill and elegance with a passion that rivaled their own. They had been warned that they would be treated like animals, yet here they were, given soap and clean blankets and the space to breathe. The intricate architecture of propaganda was crumbling, one small, confusing mercy at a time. History confirms this strange paradox. By 1945, the United States held over 400,000 Axis prisoners of war in camps across the country. And despite wartime shortages, most were given rations equivalent to those of American soldiers, a deliberate adherence to the Geneva Conventions. In stark contrast, of the 27,000 Americans captured by Japan, more than a third would not survive their captivity. For the Japanese women in Hawaii, this reality was never spoken aloud, but it was lived every single day, in the food they ate, in the order of the camp, and in the games played out before their eyes. They were supposed to feel shame and humiliation. Instead, they felt a profound and unsettling confusion. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, a group of the younger women gathered near the fence. The Americans had finished their game, but the dust they had kicked up still hung in the air, glowing gold in the last rays of the sun. "Do you think they hate us?" one of them whispered. Another shook her head slowly. "If they hated us," she replied, "why would they play for us?" The question hung in the quiet air, too heavy to be answered. Slowly, the fence itself began to change its meaning. Once, it had been a clear and brutal symbol of division, the iron teeth that separated conqueror from conquered. Now, it was becoming a frame, a window through which the women watched humanity being performed in the most unexpected ways. The soldiers' laughter, the way they slapped the dust from their uniforms, even the way they argued over a bad call, it all became a language of life, a language the women were reluctant